Hello D1. So for today's video, we are going to be talking about our first two explorers as a class. We are going to be talking about Lewis and Clark. You may have heard of Lewis and Clark before, and if you have, awesome. If you have not, that's okay, because we are going to learn all about Lewis and Clark today in a pictorial. So let's go ahead and let's jump in. My expectations for you while you are watching this video is to follow along and to also, if I ask you to repeat after me, I expect you to repeat after me. Now you may be thinking, Miss Walsh, that's a little awkward if I'm here by myself. I don't care if you shout it at the top of your lungs or if you whisper it to yourself. As long as you are repeating it, that is what I care about, because there's going to be some important vocabulary in here that you're going to be expected to know. And if you practice saying it, whether you shout it at the top of your lungs, you sing it like an opera singer, or if you whisper it, then it's going to help you remember. So please do as I ask when it happens. So let's go ahead. We are going to first talk about the biographical information. Go ahead and say biographical. Biographical means their life information about their life. And you should know that because we have talked about it before with our prefix and suffix practice. And so we have two gentlemen here, as we have mentioned before. So our first gentleman we have is Clark. And I'm going to go ahead and sketch it out so you can see, kind of have an idea of what Clark looks like. So we have our good friend Clark. As you will find out, Clark is the older of the two explorers. So with Clark, we know that he was born, as you're going to see in just a second, he was born in August 1st, 1770. So as you can imagine, this was not a recent time that he was born. He was born a while ago, so keep that in mind. He was also an army officer, and so that is some good information to know about his experience, because if he's an army officer, that means he has some training to survive in certain situations, which will be really important when we start talking about his adventure or his expedition, which is another way of saying voyage or exploration. Then we also have Lewis, and so his bud Lewis is going to be who he traveled with. And as I mentioned, Clark is the older of the two, so that makes Lewis the younger of the two explorers. And with Lewis, interestingly enough, he worked previously with Clark, and we will talk about that in just a second. And so with Lewis, he was born in August as well, funny enough, but he was born August 18th, 1774. So he is just a little bit more than 4 years younger than Clark. He was a soldier in the army, but he worked under Clark. So Clark was an officer, meaning he had a higher position, but Clark was just a soldier, so he worked below Clark. All right, now we're going to go ahead and move on to a timeline of exploration. Go ahead and say timeline. So what I mean by timeline is the amount of time. So from starting point to ending point. So we are going to talk about how long it took for them to travel. So they started in May of 1804 and ended September 1806. Oh my goodness, that is a long time. To be exact, they traveled 8 miles, which you can imagine is a long way. And another way of saying miles is MI to abbreviate. So they traveled 8,000 miles in 28 months. That is insane. 28 months. That is over 2 years. So go ahead, repeat for me. 8,000 miles in 28 months. Your turn. That is a lot to travel, but that's an even longer time. It takes us far less time to travel 8,000 miles because we had the luxury of planes. In 1770 and a little bit after that, did you think they had planes? No, they weren't traveling by plane. They were having to travel by foot, boat, and all that jazz. And we'll talk about that now in just a second. So that is how long it took them, 8,000 miles in 28 months. So you might be thinking, Miss Walsh, what does 8,000 miles look like? And that's a great question. So we are going to start where Lewis and Clark started on their trip. As you can see, this is going to be the United States. This is where we live. We live over here in California. They started in St. Louis, Missouri. And give me a me too if St. Louis, Missouri sounds familiar to you. It should, because we talked about St. Louis, Missouri before when we were reading about different types of communities. So they started in St. Louis, Missouri, and they traveled all this way. Here we have the Missouri River as a reference point. They traveled all this way to Fort Clatsop in Oregon. Now, you might be thinking, Miss Walsh, that's not very far, and it shouldn't take 28 months. Well, again, they didn't have what we have now. They don't have airplanes. They can't go on Southwest Airlines and just say, hey, I want to go over to Fort Clatsop. No, they can't do that. They had to travel by foot, by boat, all the way through all this land to get over here. So that's why it took them 28 months to travel those 8,000 miles. So go ahead, tell me where they started. They started St. Louis, Missouri. Your turn. And where did they end up? Your turn. Fort Clatsop in Oregon. All right, so now you might be thinking, Miss Walsh, why would they travel all that way? And you know, kids, that is a great question. Let's talk about it. So they explored what is called the Louisiana Purchase. Go ahead and say Louisiana Purchase. Now you might be thinking, Miss Walsh, what is the Louisiana Purchase? And that is, again, a great question. The Louisiana Purchase, in short, was new land. Go ahead and say new land. And what I mean by new land was, back in this time, we were what was called colonies, and we were living all the way over here on the East Coast. Our president at the time, Jefferson, he went to France and he bought all this land, and we're going to look at this land. He went and bought all of this land from the French. As you can see, there is so much land here. So he went and bought all of this that's in blue right here, and that is called the Louisiana Purchase. Go ahead and say again, Louisiana Purchase. And so with this Louisiana Purchase, he was wanting to know more about all this land that they had just bought. Of course, we know now that this isn't all Louisiana. Now, these are all different states that we have in our country. But back then, this was just referred to as the Louisiana Purchase. And so they wanted Lewis and Clark to discover all this land and kind of figure out, take notes. What happened here? What does it look like? What do we need to know in order to successfully live here? And so that is what they had to do. And that is why they explored those 1,000 miles in that 28 months. So go ahead, one more time for me, say Louisiana Purchase. Awesome job. And again, the Louisiana Purchase was new land that we had just bought as the colonies. And so now we're going to go ahead. We are going to talk about impact/effect. Go ahead and repeat that for me, impact/effect. And so impact/effect means what happened as a result of them traveling. What happened after they had finished their exploration, or what happened as a result of their exploration. So probably the most important thing that happened as a result of their exploration was that they met with Native American leaders. Because remember, we were not, the Europeans were not the first people over here in this state, what is now considered this state. There were Native American people that were living here. This was their land all over here, and so we were coming over, and frankly, we take their land from them as a part of the Louisiana Purchase, and so we're coming over here. And so Lewis and Clark, they met with the Native American leaders, and they conducted, meaning they put together, peace and trade negotiations. Go ahead, say peace and trade negotiations. Say it one more time for me, peace and trade negotiations. So peace and trade negotiations, a negotiation is an agreement. Go ahead and say agreement for me. An agreement is something that two groups or two parties agree upon or decide, yes, I agree to this. And so they conducted those peace and trade negotiations to make sure that their exploration was as successful as possible and to avoid as much conflict as possible. And so lastly, their other impact and effect, which is really important because this is their purpose of going to this new land or their exploration, was they brought back notes for us to study about this new land. And so what did they bring back? Please tell me. They brought back notes. And they didn't bring back notes about just whatever, like, no one cared what they were eating for breakfast. It wasn't just a diary of just like, hey, I woke up, I brushed my teeth. No, they brought back notes about animals, the weather, plants, and geography. And what I mean by geography is land. So they're describing what the land looks like. As we can see over here, we have the Rocky Mountains. And so they're describing the land. So that way, when people start to congregate over here to the West Coast, they will know exactly what they're going to experience, what they're going to have to face in order to make this trip as successful as possible. So go ahead, let's repeat what kind of notes they brought back. They brought back notes about animals, your turn. Weather, your turn. Plants, your turn. And geography, which means land, your turn. All right, and this is going to be our brief pictorial about Lewis and Clark. And so your job is going to be, Miss Walsh is going to take a picture of this pictorial, and I'm going to make it into a Google slide. And your job is to, again, I told you how to pay attention to that important vocabulary, is your job is to click and drag parts of this pictorial and some of the vocabulary words onto the picture Miss Walsh provides for you. So again, if you need to rewatch this video really briefly before, go ahead. You totally have that option. It's just a quick little video. Otherwise, that is going to be your job. And if you have any questions, let me know, to send me a message. And otherwise, that's going to be it. All right, bye, D1.